folks, and welcome back to Innovation and IP Law. This is video 3 in the video series on licensing part 3, which looks at IP agreements and competition law. In video 1 we had an overview and looked at anti-competitive agreements. In video 2 we looked at cartels and misuse of substantial market power, and now we come to exclusive dealing. Section 47 is the provision that deals with exclusive dealing, and it's a very long and convoluted provision actually, so I'm not going to put it up here, but I do like the way that Julie Clark deals with this, so go and have a look at her online resources. I've linked them in the study guide, but she says, cuts to the chase, she says that all of it really can boil down to two different kinds of behaviour. Firstly, conditional supply or acquisition, and secondly, refusals to supply or acquire. The main forms of interest for our purposes are a couple of different variants of exclusive dealing. The first one's called full line forcing. Now this is conduct that occurs vertically, so between operators at different levels of the supply chain, so between a manufacturer and a wholesaler, or a wholesaler and a distributor, so different levels of the supply chain, vertical conduct here. And full line forcing is where typically suppliers force the purchasers to buy the whole line, the full line, for all of their needs. So they basically block out the all other competition. So it's called a form of tying. So you might see that term bandied about a little bit. The other one is third line forcing, and this is very, very common, particularly in franchising agreements. So with third line forcing, you have, again, typically a supplier forcing a purchaser to buy one of their requirements from a stipulated third party, and that third party is usually in pretty good terms with the supplier. So the supplier is tying in that third party into the purchaser. So that's the issue of full line forcing and third line forcing. There can be some very good reasons why franchisees do need to have tying provisions in their agreements, though, if you think about it. So things like preserving the look or feel of a product or service, or there might be safety issues. So for example, where food preparation is involved, food's being prepared and sold at a franchise, you might need to limit the sources that your franchisee can get their ingredients to make the product it is that they'll be selling, because if something goes wrong, you need to be able to trace back where you've actually got all of the ingredients from. You can notify these forms of exclusive dealing, and I did a notification for Brumbies that you might want to look up. I've put a link to it on the in the study guide for you, and also this conduct can be authorised as well. So that's exclusive dealing in a nutshell. How does it affect IP agreements? Here I wanted to have a look at the Universal Music case, and in that case Universal Music and another company called Warner had a large catalogue of music CDs that they offered for sale to retailers. It happened, the case was handed down not long after amendments to the Copyright Act that allowed Australian retailers to buy parallel imported CDs more cheaply from other jurisdictions, so long as when the CDs were made in the other jurisdictions they weren't infringing copyright. So you could parallel import legitimately made CDs, but you could still not import pirated CDs. So what did the retailers do? They started to buy more cheaply from overseas jurisdictions. Universal and Warner weren't too happy about this, obviously, and there was a lot of pressure and threats being made that they wouldn't supply these naughty retailers in future any longer if they kept buying the cheaper overseas parallel imports. Ultimately, they did stop supply, and then the ACCC stepped in and sued Warner and Universal for breaches of sections 45, 46 and 47. They were successful on the section 46 misuse of market power issue and the section 47 exclusive dealing issue, and $450,000 worth of pecuniary penalties were imposed on each of Universal and Warner. So not surprisingly, they appealed. Their appeal was successful, and so the ACCC failed on the issue of section 46. As I said before, not terribly surprising given that those music producers only had about 16 to 17% of the market share. One thing I guess that really stood out was the very blatant nature of the threats that were made in these letters and the fairly strategic way that it was done. And there was a big question mark about, whether this kind of flagrant threat making might be indicative of market power. And I'll just read you a couple of snippets from the case. We appreciate these consequences would cause annoyance, even dismay, to the affected retailer. Depending on the circumstances, the retailer might be justified in feeling unfairly treated or victimised. However, that is not enough to demonstrate the existence of substantial market power. That doesn't mean conduct in relation to an individual market participant is irrelevant to the issue of market power. If proved, particular conduct may throw light, perhaps considerable light, on the corporation's degree of power in the relevant market. But the particular conduct is relevant only for this evidentiary value. The fact that a corporation has conducted itself towards a competitor or customer in a manner that might be considered arbitrary or high-handed does not itself establish that the corporation has a substantial degree of market power. So despite the very, as I said, flagrant nature of the threats that went on, no market power, and Warner and Universal were successful in their appeal there. They were unsuccessful in their appeal, and the ACCC succeeded on the Section 47 exclusive dealing issue. And pecuniary penalties there were raised from $450,000 to $1 million each. Also, several of the directors had penalties imposed under the accessorial liability provisions. So that is the Universal Music case. Salient lesson in towing the line once Parliament has actually legislated amendments to IP laws. So that's that case, and now we need to look at resale price maintenance. Resale price maintenance is regulated by Section 48, and as the name suggests, it is the conduct of maintaining a certain retail price or set of retail prices. Compared to the other forms of anti-competitive conduct, it's fairly straightforward. There's no need to show any substantial lessening of competition because this is another per se prohibition. So like cartels, this is another naughty no-no, and it will be prohibited per se. You do find resale price maintenance sometimes crops up with franchising, and it's not surprising, is it really? Because it'd be rather odd if you could buy a burger, a Big Mac at one McDonald's for $1 and the same Big Mac at another McDonald's for $5 or $10. The thing that you need to be careful with resale price maintenance is that it may well constitute price fixing and therefore cartel behaviour if the agreement is between competitors. So that's something certainly to watch out for, because my word, those penalties for cartel behaviour are quite severe. We'll talk about those in just a moment. You can be authorised for resale price maintenance, and it can be notified under the same Section 93 provision as for exclusive dealing. So that's resale price maintenance. And the only thing that I really wanted to discuss now was the immunity, penalties and remedies available. So immunity, as we've been saying all the way through, there's two kinds: authorisation, which I've seen expensive in public. Normally, if a company has a choice between authorisation and notification, they'll choose notification every time. Authorisation at this point is about $7,500 in application fees, and the process is public, which means that everything that you say in arguing your case that you should receive immunity will be made public on the ACCC register. And as well, interested parties, if they can identify them, will be notified that you have applied for authorisation and will be asked to make submissions. So it can get into a bit of a slanging match, and some companies will shy away from that. The quicker, cheaper option is to notify conduct. And as I said, there's a process under Section 93A for collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is where two or more smaller operators band together and target a larger operator for the purpose of getting a better deal than they would have if they tried to bargain with the big guy on their own. The Section 93 notification is slightly different. And it doesn't have the kinds of threshold values that the collective bargaining provisions have. However, Section 93 is only available for exclusive dealing and resale price maintenance. Also, other forms of immunity that we've had a brief look at before, for cartels, the joint venture exception, and also the whistleblowers immunity that we talked about before. In terms of remedies and penalties under the civil provisions, there's a range of there is a range of civil penalties for breaches of the competition law, injunctions, pecuniary penalties, damages, disqualification of directorships, and the good old catch-all, any other orders that the court might think appropriate. But by far and away, the most scary of all of these are the pecuniary penalties. Have a look on the right-hand side there. The penalty will be the highest of either $10 million, that's per count, per offence, $10 million, or if the value of the benefit can be determined 3 times the value of whatever you got out of the dealing, or if the value of benefits can't be determined 10% of the annual turnover of the company in the last 12 months. The highest of all of those will be imposed, and that is for each count, each offence. So quite eye-watering, really. The only other thing you have to think about is the criminal penalties, and these are only available for cartel provisions, so cartel conduct that we were discussing earlier. And you can have criminal penalties of up to 2,000 penalty units per offence. Currently that's about 420,000 per offence, and up to 10 years imprisonment. So very, very significant penalties here. The first criminal conviction was handed down in 2017, and the naughty company pleaded guilty, so they cooperated, so they were allowed a 50% reduction in the penalty, and the penalty was still $25 million. So enormous amount there for the criminal penalties. So that wraps up our very brief Cook's tour of Australian competition law, and it also wraps up our unit. And I hope you have enjoyed LAWS12068, Innovation and IP Law. As I always say, if you have any queries or questions, please don't hesitate to post something up on Teams. Send me an email, tweet me, Facebook me, call me up. and I hope we can resolve things. Other than that, I look forward to catching up with you in a Zoom tutorial sometime soon, and until then, bye for now.